DJ. Okay. So my name's Ed Price. For my sins, I'm an economist and former UK government official. Thank you. And I'm very grateful to be here. Please tell me what I get wrong. Okay? So if I have the courage to come up here and talk to all you guys who are very smart people, that's an exchange, and what I would like in return is for you guys to tell me afterwards, maybe during the Q&A, how you think about these issues. So I'm going to make a simple argument tonight, and the argument that I'm going to make is that United States economic policy is strategically aware without necessarily being strategically competent. United States economic policy is strategically aware but not necessarily strategically competent. And I say argument, but I want to define what I mean by the word argument. This is not necessarily a hard and fast thesis, because we are all of us living in real time through the reconfiguration of United States economic policy. It is my best guess that what the United States is doing in its macroeconomic policy domestically and its trade policy, and ultimately its policy towards capital markets, it's my best guess that what we're doing is not going to be strategically advantageous. Okay, so let me back it up and offer some context, and do so through the form of a single observation. Isn't it interesting that at just the time in modern world history that the economists got everything they ever wanted and everything they ever dreamt of, the political scientists started ringing the alarm bells? Okay, just think about that for a second. Sometime around 2000, 2005, we achieved Ricardian comparative advantage on a global scale, and we achieved Ricardian comparative advantage on a global scale alongside the proposition that this achievement would introduce world peace, democracy, manna from heaven, honey, and so on, right? And so what we really have to do, all of us in our different ways, we work around markets. What we really have to do is understand how we also work around politics, right? We have to understand that in capital markets, we're also dealing with property rights. In capital markets, we're also dealing with the international political settlement, because if other countries don't agree to partake in the FX market, for example, then there's no cross-border capital mobility and so on. So at just the moment that we in the West thought that markets were efficient, that the economies of scale had been achieved, and that we were effectively and indirectly exporting democracy to Eurasia, to one country, the People's Republic of China, that was a self-described and is a self-described communist country, and to another country, Russia, which is whatever it describes itself as, whenever it's convenient, we were wrong, right? So, in that context, all credit to President Donald Trump. All credit to the man for somehow, some way, realizing that there was a problem. Understanding with some lucidity and clarity that there was at work a global economic imbalance, and that this imbalance was also strategic, was also political, was also something to do with how countries interact, and ultimately was something to do with war and war fighting. So all credit to the president and to his cohort, his cabinet and so on, for understanding that there was a strategic problem, that there was a strategic question on the table for the United States to answer. Now, as I say, I'm not entirely convinced that what the United States is doing, what the president and his cabinet have decided to do on the economic policy front, will be strategically advantageous. The way I usually present this thought is, and this is an attempt at a balance, imagine that the President of the United States is a doctor, right? The President is a doctor, and the United States has gone to this doctor and said, I don't feel well, right? I don't feel good. As a doctor, the President is very, very good at discovering the sickness. He's very good at saying, well, this is wrong and that's wrong, and this isn't working. But when it comes to the medicine, I contend not so good, right? Perhaps sometimes it's quack medicine, and it actually isn't going to help the patient at all. So this is very, very interesting from my perspective as an analyst. Okay, so to recap, something went wrong in the world of macroeconomics in the sense that the economists got everything they ever wanted, economies of scale and trade, countries specialized, countries were integrated, countries enjoyed trade linkages, and there was international capital mobility, and yet, somehow, some way, instead of inaugurating a period of peace, that is effectively led us down the path of potential conflict. Every piece of garden furniture that's in your basement funded the PLA. All right? I hate to put it like that, but that's probably what's been going on. So, why is it that what we're doing isn't going to work, and what is it that we're doing? To answer that question, I ask myself, I'd like to break the economy into 4 parts, or at least break the economic policy arena into 4 parts. Okay? Trade policy, financial regulation, including the settlement for currency, fiscal and monetary policy. Now, when I was a younger man at the London School of Economics, a lot more than 20 years ago, a lot of people there were super interested in monetary and fiscal policy. They thought monetary and fiscal policy was super sexy, and they really lent into it and studied it and went away and became traders or central bankers, right? Which is effectively the same job. Watching the markets, watching the cycles, thinking about when things are up and when things are down. Because I was also studying history, I was way more interested in financial regulation and trade policy. And that wasn't considered very sexy. And I probably wasn't considered very sexy in other ways, and that's fine. I was enjoying nerding out on trade policy and FinReg. But in retrospect, I think that those were probably the right things to study. And I would offer the following observation, which is that one way of describing the macroeconomic and policy moment that we're in is that the fiscal and monetary policy levers that have always traditionally faced the cycle, the business cycle, and armed policymakers with some idea, according to their models, as to when to intervene with counter-cyclical policy, be it fiscal or monetary authorities. These policies in the last 10, 15 years have moved their sights away from the cycle towards the structure. Inversely, trade policy and financial regulation, which are supposed to be set and leave policies, they're supposed to be about the economic structure, for some reason, they have now shifted their focus away from the structure and towards the cycle. And so with the remaining time that I have, I'm going to try and explain what I mean by that, and why I think that what the United States is doing on its economic policy front isn't going to help it in the self-assigned tasks that we'll describe. So, after the global financial crisis, there was a traditional monetary policy intervention in the sense that a bank run, effectively, even though it was banks running on other banks, had affected market sentiment. There was liquidity hoarding, and rates were cut. That's what you'd expect. That's textbook. But there was also, of course, quantitative easing. So there were bond purchases. There was the idea that the central bank will effectively create new funds, fiat currency, from nothing, that will then appear on balance sheets, effectively to nationalize market liquidity. And so there's the first example of how the one arena of economic policy, in this case monetary policy, which is designed in the textbook for counter-cyclical growth smoothing, has actually become a permanent part of our financial function. Right? So I just used the phrase nationalizing market liquidity. That's a bit hyperbolic, I wouldn't necessarily put that in an article, but it's the clearest, bluntest way that I can think to convey the point that our monetary authorities are now essential to the functioning of our markets. They are to do with the structure, the existence of our markets, our capital markets, rather more than they are the financial cycle. Now, after that, 2010, we saw Dodd-Frankenstein, to many of you in the room that suffered through it. And Dodd-Frank was in effect, the nationalization of international financial regulation. It was in effect Basel III as applied to the American domestic system. We all know what Dodd-Frank was. We don't need to go over it. Higher capital, less leverage, more liquidity. Okay. But if you think about it, this was the shift of financial regulation away from the structure, which is we'll set it and we'll leave it and we won't worry about it. In the 90s and the early 2000s, we effectively had no regulation. Basel I was a joke and Basel II hadn't really been implemented before the crisis, to a serious concern with the domestic extension of bank credit. So Dodd-Frank was, if you like, a counterfactual. If it hadn't been the case that Dodd-Frank came in, I imagine we would have seen more business formation, small business formation, and probably some degree of less, discontentment among low-income households, right? Because the level of bank credit available in this country, bank consolidation, so on, changed as a result of Dodd-Frank. So Basel III effectively inserted itself into the American business cycle, and I don't think that the Obama administration understood that or did enough to counteract it. Okay, so monetary policy, I think I just demonstrated or argued, moved from the cycle to the structure. FINREG moved from the structure to the cycle. And incidentally, the reason that Basel III was designed to restrain bank lending, effectively, was because the alternative was to abolish capital mobility and therefore guarantee against financial contagion that way. But of course, Uncle Sam couldn't allow that. So we had to punish bank lending at home and effectively stop lending to poor people. Okay, so I also mentioned fiscal policy and trade policy. Now, fiscal policy is for the cycle, effectively. There is investment, yes, investment is part of the growth equation, government investment, government spending, but it is effectively the essence of politics, right? There's one party in any country that says we should spend more, there's one party in any country that says we should spend less, the party that says we should spend more doesn't really care about inflation because it's addressing renters, the party that says we should spend less does care about inflation because it's addressing property owners, and it's a cycle, it's a back and forth, right? And it's a political cycle. But fiscal policy, particularly under the Biden administration, has now cast its eyes away from the cycle and towards the structure. So fiscal policy is now, in the United States, effectively industrial policy. And President Biden's Build Back Better plan was, to my mind, a very funny way of confronting international communism by importing it. It's effectively saying we're going to just, hit the spend button at home and we'll build factory plants, and that's fine. And there's no downside to that. Of course there is, it's called debt. And I don't think that President Trump has been much better on spending, to be honest with you. I think he's effectively a Keynesian small L liberal, but we can debate that in the Q&A, economically at least. And then finally, trade policy. This is probably the more interesting of the four in terms of assessing the strategic value or otherwise of American economic policy. But it's pretty obvious that the fundamental proposition of President Trump is that he doesn't like trade. Right? He doesn't think it's a good idea. And he doesn't think it's a good idea because, to use his vernacular at Davos, he feels like we're getting screwed. Right? Now, that's about as far as he'll get in terms of his enunciation of this idea. And it would take, I think, perhaps a better economist than me to really dig into what he means by getting screwed, but I'll give it a go. I think that the president, when he says that we're getting screwed through trade, I think what he means is that somehow, some way, we are overpaying for goods anyway. Moreover, if there was a war or another conflict, we wouldn't have those goods because we no longer have the capacity to make them at home. Okay? The first part is completely wrong. It's like wildly wrong. We create a fiat currency from nothing, and we hand it out like confetti, and we buy whatever we want, right? And all of these, I have a Japanese pickup. I bought that Japanese pickup with fiat currency. I didn't have to earn foreign currency. I just bought it with fiat currency that my country as an American citizen produces. And as a bonus, the engine in that Japanese pickup is not in a fighter plane, right? So we totally won the Second World War, and we co-opted the capital stock of Japan and Germany, and to some degree the financial services of the UK, and brought them into our system. Okay? So the first part is just wildly wrong. The second part of the president's problem with trade is probably true, right? We learned this during the COVID pandemic. So again, credit to him where credit is due. If we have a health emergency and we don't want to let people die, which was one option, we could have said, everyone older, forget it, you're becoming a burden on the state, everyone younger, you'll get it and you'll be fine. We didn't. We tried to get as much health equipment into the country as possible, ventilators and masks, and we couldn't because they weren't made here. So if you blow that up into a war scenario and double click in there and think, what else do we need that we don't have, he's probably right. Nonetheless, to finish this thought, trade policy has shifted remarkably from a set it and leave it structurally minded economic policy to something that is intervening effectively in the cycle, in the day-to-day experience of consumers, prices, households, and household economic behavior. Okay? So, I contend, and again I ask everyone to tell me how this is wrong during the Q&A or later, I contend that something strange is afoot, in the sense that fiscal and monetary policy designed for growth smoothing, designed for monitoring cycles, are now more concerned than they ever have been with the structure of the economy, and vice versa, financial regulation and trade policy, for whatever reason, have taken their eye off the structure of the economy and are now much more interested in doing things that affect the cycle and effectively microeconomics, right? For what that observation is worth, I think we should think about why that might be the case. And perhaps it's like this. If the United States is effectively moving to a war footing, what else could you possibly expect it to do? Right? If the United States is effectively moving to a war footing, what else could you possibly expect its economic policymakers to do? Other than to reconfigure trade linkages and exposures in a way that at least gives you the option of continuing your economy without excessive external disruptions. Let me be very, very clear, because there's a camcorder there. I am not saying that the United States is moving to a war footing and wants a war. Very, very clear. I'm not forecasting conflict. I think that it's pretty charlatanic for people in my community, people who are analysts of the economy and of the world of security, to go on TV and say that the world is ending. I don't think the world is ending. I don't know if the world is ending, at least. But the only way to describe the economic policy decisions that the United States is making is that it increases optionality in a world not just characterized by less trade, but also characterized by more conflict. Okay? So, here's why I think this ain't going to work. Right? If you follow all those strings, and maybe there's a hole in one of them, or two of them, or three of them, and we can pull the threads. But here's why I think this isn't going to work. The one area of the post-war international economy that the United States cannot dismantle is the dollar standard. Now, I say cannot dismantle. I mean, we could, right? I mean, we could all of us write on a piece of paper, on an envelope, like, here's the stupid stuff we would have to do in XYZ time frame in order to destroy the dollar standard. But it's just not something that is strategically either plausible or desirable. It is, in my opinion, a hard restraint on American power that we are exposed to the world through the dollar. Now, the dollar has many, many upsides. I just described one, right? My big, beautiful blue truck. I use the phrase big and beautiful advisedly, which I didn't earn, let's be honest. My economic system earned. And all sorts of other things, like, someone from the world of security the other day was describing to me just how much information there is about every single dollar bill, and how a CCTV camera can scan the serial number and follow it through a city. And if you commit a crime anywhere in the world using dollars, you're in trouble with Uncle Sam and so on. So there are major, major upsides. But there's also a downside, which is that the Ricardian comparative advantage that I described to you at the start of this talk is only comparative advantage if you don't mind sovereign debt. Ultimately, this is where we're going to have to, again, give some credit to the president. The idea that the United States would primarily export a fiat currency, and I mean its primary export is effectively money, and that means effectively trust, and that means effectively reputation, in exchange for goods, in exchange for commodities, and in some degree in exchange for compliance and obedience with foreign populations, because our security forces, our army, as we demonstrated the other day, can find you anywhere. The idea that would be the Ricardian comparative advantage that is sustainable is foundationally incorrect, right? So maybe I'll make this point as sort of the last big point, and we can open this up a little bit, because I don't want to give you like another monologue experience this week after the president's Davos speech, right? I mean, we've all sat through one recently, so I'll try and wrap this up, and then maybe we can debate this. But let's take this back to Richard Nixon. Let's take this back to Richard Nixon in 1971, and the decision that he made, and then effectively how President Trump is trying to deal with the outcome of that decision, and why I think what President Trump is doing won't work. So, Richard Nixon, in some ways, a very strong president, right? I mean, before he sort of messed up, he was a very competent thinker and very eloquent, and a foreign policy genius by all accounts. And he rightly understood one of the economic problems facing the United States in the late 60s and early 70s as effectively a foreign policy problem, and as effectively a problem in the Cold War. And that was what to do about the gold peg, right? So I'm sure we have many nerds in here. We don't need to describe the first Bretton Woods system, but effectively the United States was constraining itself in the creation and use of dollars. It wanted to fight the war in Vietnam. It wanted to spend money at home on welfare, and it was realizing that it was creating too many claims on the gold stock that it had, and effectively the European powers and others might run on gold, and that'd be a problem. So Richard Nixon said, well, let's just move to fiat. Let's just move to fiat. Because if we're confronted with a decision between, in the long run, possibly creating too many dollars versus the rational economic size of the United States, that's a tomorrow problem. We need the dollar standard in the world, and we need to be very liquid as a government to spend and win during and in the Cold War. So that was the decision that Richard Nixon made. There was the need for the Volcker disinflation, but effectively Nixon created the Great Moderation, and effectively Nixon created the global financial crisis. Big, bold claims tell me I'm wrong, right? The third thing that Richard Nixon effectively created was Trump. Because one day, somehow, a president was going to have to come along and say, look guys, the cost-benefit analysis of a comparative advantage, thank you, of a comparative advantage in which we sell currency and currency services, capital markets abroad, in exchange for everything physical, has to end as measured by national debt, sovereign debt. He ain't wrong. Here's the punchline, and we'll open this up. If the answer to that problem is that we're going to enter into a competition with the main counterpart, currently an adversary, possibly in the future an enemy, which is the aforementioned People's Republic of China, then you have your choice. You either slowly destroy the dollar standard at your own desire, i.e. you go on one final big spending splurge of fiat currency, you reboot the military, you bribe who you need to bribe, you kill who you need to kill, and then if it falls apart, you've consolidated. Perhaps you do have a better hold on Greenland, Venezuela, and other territories. Perhaps you do, all right? I hate to say it. But you can't, at the same time, do things that shrink the size of your own economy. You cannot say, well, we're going to take all of these excellent workers who just want to be here and work hard and kick them out because we need them for a competition with a more populous country. So, I'll end in the way I started. American economic policy is strategically aware, but not necessarily strategically competent. It is strategically aware because the president, to his credit, has identified, through instinct perhaps, rather than careful macroeconomic analysis, but through instinct he has identified the fundamental global economic imbalance of our time, which is that we cannot continue exporting fiat currency indefinitely, and instead we need to do something in the real economy to make ourselves stronger and more secure. But it follows that if you want to do something to make yourself stronger in the real economy and more secure in a global competition, you need every single last Mexican worker you can get. You can have competition with China, but you can't have nationalism too. Paradox. Okay? So I'll pause there. I'll end there. Please, in any Q&A, please make remarks, please challenge me. I might have this all completely backwards. Thank you.
I'll just get some microphones for you guys.
Sure.
Questions? Start here.
So thank you very much. I think we just saw 4.4% GDP growth. And I think we saw the population shrinking, that self-deportation and everything. So isn't that not against your thesis there? That fewer people, but productivity has skyrocketed? And I wonder about replacing low-skilled workers with Optimus robots.
Right, the robots. Thank you for that penetrating question. Yes, on the face of things, that completely blows me out of the water. Because the United States is moving towards, it's closing the output gap, right? And 4.4 is pretty damn good. What I would suggest, however, is that the size of the economy and the type of the economy that we would need in a serious confrontation with China is not a peacetime economy. And some of the problems that I just described to you, I think are lingering, not least in the economic policy community, as to how exactly this economy works. So 4.4, if, by the way, we trust the stats anymore, we stopped publishing some of them, and again, the other country that's done that recently is China, so with a pinch of salt. But okay, let's take it at face value that 4.4 is good. Let's borrow from the Fed and their thinking, and notice, and we'll get to the robots as a part of this, notice that they're sort of clearing their throats about what exactly the inflation target should be. So in a developed economy, you might expect three numbers to be 2% growth, 2% inflation, 4% unemployment. And that's like equilibrium, right? That's like these elusive stars that Powell talked about. That's great. 4.4 growth is kind of hard. In a good way, maybe, after the last couple of years, but it's a bit hard. And the Fed is also saying, well, maybe inflation should be 3, okay, which over 4 years is 12 points loss in real terms. So I concede that. I'm also not sure that we understand why that's happening. I could go through a laundry list, I was earlier, a laundry list of painful things that I've got wrong as a macroeconomist in the last 5 years, simply because I've sort of, gone through the textbook in my head and said, well, this should happen. I called inflation right, I got hard landing so badly wrong. Okay, so on the face of things, I would concede that point to you, with the caveat that I'm not sure that those three numbers and the relationship between them we fully understand in this peacetime economy. And by the way, unintended consequences. Yeah. Now, the robots would be great. I would love to have a robot where I live, but I mean, when? So this is the other issue.
Well, self-driving cars are here, and that's essentially a robot driver, right?
It is, and my what my brain wants to say is I don't know what the ultimate effect of that would be on the economy. Let's imagine a sort of hypothetical scenario in which the Fed's unemployment bullseye is no longer 4%. Can't be 4% because of self-driving cars. And by the way, driving is the #1 occupation globally. It has to be 8%. And they get up in their grey suits and they say, well, we figured it out, don't worry. 8% is now the perfect equilibrium number for unemployment. I mean, what growth figure do you need then in order to pay back the debt, maintain the military, and so on? So, yes, on the face of things, with caveats. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the conversation. I have quite a few questions over here.
Yeah, sorry.
But just in the interest of time, I'll do two.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll catch up afterwards. So Jameson Greer has talked about Alan Dobson's book, which was Economic Statecraft for Survival, 1933 to 1991, as kind of one of his guiding principles as he's thinking about U.S. trade policy. So with that in mind, I'm not sure you read it, but essentially it discusses the use of trade policy more through the economic lens, which would argue, and I don't know if there's a question, but would like your thoughts, that it's always been more cyclical than structural, right? Because we've been facing these different, whether it's Russia during the Cold War, different kind of challenges. So just that's kind of one thing we'd like your thoughts on. And the second piece on the population, so obviously GDP growth is a function of number of people and how much they produce, but as it relates to the strength of the nation vis-a-vis the debt, I guess the question becomes how many of these people are, for a kind of crude way of putting it, net takers from the system, right? So to the extent that you have good workers who are not reliant on government largesse, yes, clearly their productivity will be missed, but on aggregate, you're actually getting rid of people who are net takers from the system. Aren't you in a better place, albeit at a smaller place, because you're cutting down from that debt load potentially?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. If that was true, yes. But the people we're getting rid of pay taxes. So if on a fiscal posture, probably not.
But wouldn't the cumulative number of amount of taxes they pay have to cover the amount of benefits that they either explicitly or implicitly receive from the government?
Well, I think the great irony is that if you're undocumented, so to speak, it's easier to pay taxes than it is to take out of the system. I think that's the great asymmetry. Again, there's a case-by-case basis, right? And it's important to try and study the labor market in more depth than me just saying it's like this, it's like that. But I think that a plausible proposition is that we are getting rid of people who are net positive for the fiscal position. I'm not interested in the fiscal position. I'm interested in how many people we can get into factories to make 155 shells. On the trade policy side of things, yes, there are many authors who write about trade policy almost as if they're writing about statecraft. But I think that the general trend of global trade has also been the general trend of the US economy, which was upwards and to the right. And that has been empirically a result of trade, and empirically a result of more trade, freer trade. Again, you then have to double click on it and say, well, what is that growth? What does it look like? To your good question, what exactly did these workers look like? And it's shifted over time towards consumption. So again, the US economy is like 70% consumption. And that might be another problem in the vein that you've just described with regard to workers. Like, should we really be eating as much? I shouldn't be eating as much, right? These really, really simple measures of what exactly an economy is that's successful, what exactly it is an economy that's doing good things. Now, ultimately, you can combine those two things. The workers in this country, to use a Marxist phrase, the working class, noticed somehow, some way, that they were, in the president's word, getting screwed through trade, right? And it's this bad. For the last 20 years, the Chinese Communist Party has been subsidizing our working class through Walmart. So they have us on the hook for that, and we have to reconfigure the relationship between our workers, the number of workers, what they consume, and so on. Very difficult to do in a free market system. Yes, sir.
We got a whiff the other day of the Danish pension fund saying, we don't really need
U.S. bonds anymore. I don't know what the statistic is, but the sovereign wealth fund of Norway and the Swiss National Bank probably own 2% of the U.S. equity market. Are we moving to a point where, I'm sorry to use bad language, but Trump is just such a dick that the foreigners are the ones who say, we don't need you anymore?
We've already moved to a point where the president is a dick towards other countries, unfortunately. What you're now describing is the extent to which their central banks, in their reaction function, offload, if I think I understand what you're saying, offload.
We don't need to buy.
Or don't buy anymore.
Yeah, we can't really
Right.
sell what we own.
Right.
Too big.
Right.
But we don't really need any more Apple. We
Yeah.
don't need any more Amazon. We don't really need
Yeah.
more of your stuff. And that's the ultimate, the Congress is feckless, but the foreigners are the ones who, bring them down.
Effectively, that's the scenario I'm describing or hinting at with this talk. Effectively, I think that's why what we're doing isn't going to work, because we have a pre-existing exposure to our own debt and to the liquidity or otherwise of our debt markets, right, our government bonds. It's almost worse than what you're describing, because we are already there. We're already at that point of no return. We're just there in a sort of suspended animation. So I'll tell you what I mean by that. When Nixon moved to the fiat system, if you describe that in prose, that is effectively the decision to allow there to be created more dollars than should exist versus the size of the US economy, its fundamentals, and its projected growth. That is effectively saying, we're going to meet global dollar demand so that this currency can continue to exchange and act as a reserve function for foreigners. By definition, because the United States economy is smaller than the rest of the world, that meant creating dollars, fiat dollars, in effectively an inflationary ratio to the size of the US economy. By the way, the US economy's share of global GDP has shrunk over time, so that problem's got worse, and we've issued more and more dollars, so that problem's got chronic and acute at the same time. In simple terms, the reason that what you're saying hasn't happened, the reason that we haven't had a 2008 style crisis every weekend, is that foreigners don't just demand, but hold dollars and dollar-denominated products. And so at any moment that this great wellspring of demand slows, let alone dries, you're right. We wouldn't even need to see selling action, which could be pretty problematic, to see the problems that we've already created for ourselves. I'll give you this thought. In the 2007-8 financial crisis, if we translate what happened into a thesis, again, into simple prose, the big banks said, hold on a second, I don't understand my balance sheet. I don't know what I own. That means I don't know what my counterparty owns. Therefore, I will hoard cash, right? And the government version of that is, why aren't these guys doing anything? Oh, they're scared. We will create money so that they're not scared. Daddy will come in and buy things, right? I don't know that if the new thesis in the future was there are too many dollars, i.e. not too few, which was the 2007-8 problem, I don't know what economic policy could fix that. Certainly not another round of QE, because that would be counterintuitive, right? If the worry is what people don't want or are selling dollars effectively, I imagine you'd need a 25% interest rate at home for 3 years, which is no bueno.
So is that Trump's Achilles heel?
I honestly think that he's restrained, not as he said by his morality, but by the stock and bond markets, because instinctively he understands that they are linked to the dollar standard and our debt-financed military. This is my supposition.
Who are the Danes going to sell those bonds to? And they sell them, and somebody, how does that currency work?
Well, I think it would be bad if they tried to sell them and no one wanted to buy them. I think that would also be bad.
Well,
right?
what are they going to buy them for? They're going to buy them for dollars, and if they sell them to Norway has them. If they sell them to Japan has them. I don't really understand how that works. we've been exporting dollars, I agree with you, but those dollars are out there.
Mhm.
Some trillions of dollars are out there.
Mhm.
And how does the world get rid of those dollars? I don't think they can.
I don't think they can, but ultimately the people responsible for them are us, and we don't want to buy them, right? This is what I'm saying. Our economic policy infrastructure was able to step in as a buyer during the 2007-8 crisis, and is still a buyer, right? I mean, forget QT, that's nonsense, a fairy tale. Tapering, forget it. But I don't know that if the story was different, if the story of the crisis was not that there's been a idiosyncratic malfunction in American capital markets and banking, but a systemic malfunction in the dollar standard, I'm honestly saying I don't know if US stepping in as a buyer of last resort would work, right? So you're kind of making the same point in a way, and I'll sort of accede to you in the sense that we don't know what this would look like, and we don't know what malfunctions could occur as a result of the story changing.
So if the US buys them, it buys them for dollars. The Danes now have dollars. What do they do with the dollars?
I understand what you're saying.
They buy land. In the
I
US, they
understand,
buy
I understand.
Amazon stock. They buy, Nvidia, whatever. But it seems to me they're just exchanging one US asset for another.
With possibly price action and a greater expense. See, this is again, being honest when I say I don't know,
Yeah.
but I think if the story of the dollar standard changed, if the international thesis changed, the international thesis right now is dollars are good. Whatever happens, dollars are good. And that's good so far for us, other than, as I think you also agree, we have too much sovereign debt, and there needs to be some sort of correction. What I'm trying to describe is my confusion as to the...
Although I do remember when Bill Clinton balanced the budget,
Well, that was
there was
Bush
a
Senior,
whole
but
lot
yes.
of stuff out there saying the world needs more dollar debt. The world runs on
Yes.
dollar debt.
Yes. Yes.
So we accommodated the world.
Yes, we have accommodated the world, and I don't know how we would stop accommodating the world. This is what I'm trying to be honest about. Yeah.
So I just want to continue on his point. So if there is a disconnect, you just cannot sell your bonds because the country who is holding a lot of bonds, they're going to suffer because if you disconnect, the prices will go down.
Yeah.
So that's the reason you have to do it slowly over the time. Now my question to you is, dollar is like the global currency, right? Most of the transactions globally, 60, 70, 80% are done in dollar. What do you think is a tipping point when that gets to like 40%, 50%? Because, when there's a downward spiral, people panic and you get affected the most, right? And, rates are kind of trying to form their own currency and some way of actually, counter-reacting against dollar. Do you have any thesis on that? Like at what point the tipping would, be, go in a downward spiral, like 30, 40, 50%? What would be that number? Have you ever thought of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It would be wildly dishonest of me to say, yes, here's my number. I haven't done that work, and I don't know what it would be. And I think that the history of financial crises is very often perception. In retrospect, in 2006, subprime was great, right? Like it worked perfectly as collateral in overnight lending. What happened, right? What changed that there was this kind of, this, to mention Keynes again, the animal spirits changed. I don't know what the number would be. Were I a nefarious adversary of the United States, however, I might start trying to nibble away at the dollar smile. So maybe I'll give you this answer and maybe we'll wrap because I don't want to go over time. No? Okay. Okay, so I don't know the number, but I can suggest a behavior. If I was another large country that had a vested interest in the ultimate demise of the dollar standard, and therefore the ability of the United States to consume and fight the way it does right now, I would look at the dollar smile, which is effectively the flight to safety during bad macro news, even if that bad macro news comes out of the US, because in a relative beauty contest, what you want, to your good point, the US, we're still the top. And I would say to myself, okay, I'm going to invent some product, some financial product, some offering, something, whatever it is, however we structure it, that automatically offers anyone that buys it 1 point above whatever they're going to get out of the US. Not a big issue, right? Like, whatever it is, something small, a couple billion, and we'll see who buys it. And we'll just put that idea out there that actually there's this new other safe asset. Bitcoin is effectively, in some ways, that asset, right? People, if they're using it or holding it for good reasons, it's probably a dollar hedge, I would suggest. But that's only one way of doing it. It's overly complicated. Another country could just say, we'll just pay you, right? Now, the paradox of that is probably it would be in dollars. So, again, I don't know, right? You're right. But the dollar smile isn't going to go away, but it might not be as broad, right? And then people are thinking, and you're just messing with the system. So it's a very long-winded way of saying I don't know. We don't know what the number would be. But, you know, sort of psychological numbers like 40 trillion in sovereign debt. Someone's going to think, wait a minute, right? And start doing their homework, probably me and others. So what I'm saying is there are moments in financial history where systems that seem stable, Minsky again, right? Systems that seem stable, something happens and afterwards everyone says, of course it was going to fall apart like that.
Quick one.
Yes, sir.
Maybe for the benefit of the hedge fund managers out here, all who are very smart, have their own research and their own philosophy. Do you have any thoughts on, not what they should do, you're not a portfolio manager.
No.
Some considerations as they're running their firm about the things you're talking about? And do you really think all the other countries have the same view? I know I stacked the questions there, but
Yes.
is there anything they should consider as they're running the hedge fund day to day, no matter what strategy they're in?
Sure thing. Well, yes, you're right to point out I'm not a markets guy, I'm not a portfolio manager. The answer will not be advice in that sense. I would honestly say that expect paradigms not to work and invest in agility, right? Invest in mental agility, because there is a supply side glut of information. The people that work for you, no doubt, are very smart. They might suffer from some form of myopic fixation with their market or their way of doing things, or how they trade. And I would ensure that you, as leaders, and your workers, every Monday morning, remind each other that whatever's in the textbook might not be the guide. We are in a period now where and this is, I suppose, and I thank you for the question, the very point of this talk is that we're not just talking about the cycles, we're not even just talking about the fundamentals, we're talking about the structure of the economy, and the structure of the economy as an ecosystem. And so maybe I'll add this to my response. Whoever your bond market guy is, he needs to be talking to your container shipping guy, and they both need to be talking to whoever it is that does whatever other market. Because as these levers are changed and moved and pulled around, we're going to see new relationships emerging in real time. The most fundamental first principles assumptions that we're making will be challenged. They won't all break. But I would remind your staff, people that work for you, who I'm sure are very, very smart, that sometimes being very, very smart is a problem if you're continuing to do the same thing, thinking that it will keep paying off in an information environment that is very demonstrably not predictable. Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.